and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? One of the features of the Bible is that it does not spare us the ugly side of humanity. Having exposed us to the folly of pride in the Edomites, Obadiah goes on to paint a picture of the darker side of the human heart. This is revealed when he indicates to them the reason why the impending judgment upon them is invoked and why it is so intense and final. In each of the indictments brought against the Edomites, we must pause to confess that the very evil they practice lies embedded in us. And the words of the great hymn, "The vilest offender can fit any of us like a glove fits the hand."
In his book, The Satan Syndrome, Nigel Wright says, "There is a fundamental sense in which evil is not something that can be made sense of. The essence of evil is that it is something which is absurd, bizarre, and irrational. It is the nature of evil to be inexplicable, an enigma and a stupidity. The actions of the Edomites are a fine example of this." Obadiah speaks like the prosecution lawyer reading out the charges against Edom at verses 11 to 14. "On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble."
Here is the evidence that the prosecution would likely place before the court in their opening arguments. Exhibit A. When Israel came out of Egypt and wanted to pass through the land of the Edomites to enter into the promised land, the Edomites wouldn't let them. Numbers 20, chapter 20, verses 14 to 21. The court would then hear evidence taken from the record of the kings in 1 and 2 Samuel of various attacks that the Edomites led or participated in against Jacob's descendants. Obadiah builds the case of God against the nation of Edom. Each new line of text outlines a chilling progressive manifestation of evil, spurred by a hatred that seemed to know no end. Bible commentator Guzik cites Trapp as saying, quote, "Sin proceeds by degrees. Neither is any man at his worst at first."
I am sure you can easily identify one person in your circle that typifies this. I am also equally sure that if you look in the mirror, you will find a second person of which this tends to be true. Let's examine closely the progression of the latent evil displayed by Edom. The first indictment is found in verse 11. I call it passive hatred. They watched as enemies plundered their blood relatives. The gall of such conduct is heightened by the fact that the victim was their very brother Jacob, who was commanded not to hate the Edomites in Deuteronomy 23:7. This friendship was not reciprocated by the descendants of Esau. Whatever the reason, the Edomites from the time of Moses had always been actively hostile to the Israelites and seemed to live with a lingering desire for vengeance. They therefore welcomed and seized the opportunity in the day of Israel's calamity, a phrase repeated to show the greatness of it, and as an aggravation of the sin of the Edomites in behaving and doing as they did at such a time. When filial kindness, or at the very least human concern, ought to have kicked in, they stood by and watched an enemy attack the Israelites.
When we look at the actions of the Edomites as presented by the prophet, we certainly see not just passive but hostile opposition. Edmund Burke's statement that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing is absolutely correct. The obtaining of pleasure during the committal of evil acts has been the subject of extensive study, and yet it remains a chilling reminder of the damage that has been done to the human psyche by the fall. There is so much in our society that cries out for the voice and the activism of those who are on the side of law and order and decency, yet the majority dwell in the palace of apathy. By our silence, by our see and blind, hear and deaf attitude, we may just as well be complicit with those who are responsible for the calamities of the oppressed. Sometimes doing nothing is a great sin. How many of us have solid, verifiable information that can help solve some of the heinous crimes that remain unsolved? Does it bother us that gunmen act with impunity in broad daylight because they have good enough reason to believe that the average citizen will see and do nothing? Narrow self-interest, personal gain, upward mobility, raw fare, and plain callousness are just some of the reasons why we stand by and watch the plunder of the innocent, the weak, the children, the wards of the state, the elderly, the undocumented residents, the refugees, the minorities, the others.
As we explore this indictment further, we realize that Edom actually did something which is worse than nothing. Nothing doing. They rejoiced over another's misfortune and suffering and used it as an occasion to exalt themselves. They gloated over the pain of their brethren, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Obadiah chides. The prophet Obadiah qualifies the nature of the aloofness with which the Edomites watched the calamity of their brethren. It was with pleasure and complacency, having had a mind to have destroyed them themselves, and know that it was being done by a foreign enemy, they could not hold back expressing their joy on that occasion. I have listened with great concern to the gloating that members of the religious community have spouted at the news that alleged homosexuals were beaten or killed all too easily beaten in this country. Many within and outside of the church all too easily fall into the temptation of rejoicing over news that some prominent figure in the church has been exposed in sin publicly. The wise man cautioned against this in Proverbs 24:17. Do not gloat when your enemy falls. When they stumble, do not let your heart rejoice. The malice and hatred that we have for others that is not surrendered to the power of love will always find self-expression.
There is a way in which we may never hire the assassin ourselves, but will certainly refuse to offer help to some persons if they are bleeding after the assassin has done his part. Or we may certainly have a belly full of laughter at their demise. What about the matter of character assassination? How readily do you and I facilitate the butchering of other people's dignity in their absence? When the Levitical Code of chapter 19 warns against cursing the deaf and putting a stumbling block in the path of the blind, it has this as its target. Do you put a stop to those who speak evil of others when they are not present to defend themselves? My challenge to us is to let it go. Bury the hatchet. Release yourself from the burden of prolonged hatred. It is like a cancer that eats away at the soul. This is why Jesus taught in the sermon of Matthew 5 that murder begins in the heart. Let love fill your heart. Let peace reign. Having read this chapter, I invite you to honestly ask yourself, If there is someone that you would think twice about helping if you see them being attacked, and whether you would secretly or openly gloat over their demise, if there is, it's time to have a little talk with Jesus. Chapter 5, the devil inside, passive oppression.
The devil without. I'm going to ask Reverend Courtney Richards to come.